topic to handle tonight, as you know, so we will get right to it as soon as we can. I'd like to start. I'm going to start this evening's meeting with a land acknowledgement, and I hope you'll indulge me tonight. I'm going to read the full City of Toronto acknowledgement because I think it's important, because we've had another painful discovery today, and I think everybody would probably take this time happily. I acknowledge that the land we are standing on, although meeting virtually for today's meeting, is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Toronto is built on sacred land that is part of an agreement between Indigenous peoples and then extended to allied nations to peacefully and respectfully care for it. By personally making a land acknowledgement, you are taking part in an act of reconciliation. You are honoring the land and Indigenous heritage, which dates back in Toronto over 10,000 years. So miigwech, everyone, for taking part in that acknowledgement. So tonight we have some special guests with us. Tonight is to look at the proposal from city staff to license rooming houses in parts of Toronto that are not currently eligible for the licensing of a rooming house, and that means all of Etobicoke right now. Only partially that's the case. All of North York and all of Scarborough. We've heard from many people, so we know that this is a big step. This is jarring, but we do want to tackle it in a town hall, because the decision is not finally made yet, and not finalized in terms of detail or even yes or no, because Planning and Housing has adopted the proposal that staff sent with a few extra details, and then they have forwarded it on to council. And so Mayor Tory and the 25 councillors will be voting on it in a couple of weeks. So what we're going to do tonight is give you a bit of a brief history of how we came to be asking for staff to report on this and to propose something. And then I'm going to introduce you to some panelists who I think can help you with how staff developed this proposal. It's important to remember, and this reflects somewhat on some of the comments I've received in the mail. Some people have said this will lead to terrible unregulated tenant situations. In fact, that is the situation that we have today throughout Scarborough, Toronto, or North York, and parts of Etobicoke, particularly in neighborhoods close to campuses, the suburban campuses, and it is very difficult to enforce those. We have an enforcement officer tonight that will describe the situation that we live in now. We have unregulated rooming houses already. Most of you know that. Many people that signed up to take part tonight have been the very neighbors who've had to report homes on their street, and they are entirely unlicensed and entirely unregulated. What makes them even more difficult to deal with is that they currently are protected. A single family dwelling is protected by certain provincial statutes. We can't bang down the door and go in as a bylaw officer. A police officer could if he thinks a crime is being committed and has a warrant. A firefighter can if he thinks the building is on fire. Bylaw officers, they enforce municipal bylaws and have to be invited in. And when we don't have a licensing regime, we don't have a bylaw to deal with rooming houses, because they're simply not acknowledged in this area, even though we all know that in reality they exist. And so we find ourselves in this unregulated, difficult situation. And I've been bringing it to council's attention and to staff's attention really since becoming a councillor. When I first began to represent former Ward 33, it was just after the double cohort year, and provincial government had given Seneca College a large fortune to double the size of its campus and double the size of its student body. And that sparked growth that continues to this day. They are now more than triple the size of institution they were the day I got elected. And the same residence that existed on their property at that time is still the only residence on their property. And so we have a lot to do in terms of improving housing. All the post-secondaries have a joint committee that's working on regulated student dwellings on their campuses. They sometimes face planning difficulty in getting them built. They're working on that with the city. We also have an affordability program, and some of you have mentioned that in your email. I'm going to wait until after the presentation to go through what is the affordability housing spectrum, because the presentation that staff give explains that a little bit, and I think it's going to be important for people to know. But on the upside, you should know that the work to continue to add affordable housing opportunities, particularly in our neighborhood, continues. The Housing Now project, the Mayor Tory announced over by the hospital that would bring 300 units, is underway. 160 affordable units were approved over at Victoria Park and Shepherd with the Lansing Square proposal. 40 units will be part of the Bayview Village Mall proposal. Our 2 social housing revitalizations rebuilt and added to the rent geared to income units there. We have a lot of increased affordable housing in and around Don Valley North, but all of them are either working on subsidy, which is, as you know, a long waiting list, or the affordable missing middle is what we talk about. All of those units that are going into condos, they're really for working people of a certain income. For instance, a mother-led family that was looking to get one of the affordable units in a condo would be looking at having to have a living of about $60,000, a couple $90,000. This is yet a different, this issue comes about, and the reason we have illegal rooming houses is a different level of affordability. And so you'll hear a little more about that in staff's presentation. So I'm going to let them present, and then when we go to Q&A, Maggie will come back on the line, who as you know, always helps us moderate town halls, and she'll give you the ins and outs of how to get your question asked and how to interact in the meeting, and all of the staff members and guests that we have here today can help answer the questions, and if it's something a real address-based local nature, I can help with those answers as well. So without further ado, I see Carola Perez-Book and Emma Bally. They have the presentation. It's very similar to the presentation that was presented to councillors. And then we have an actual enforcement officer that some of you may have met, who's living this all in real time in his daily work. And so we'll hear from him, and we can ask him our specific enforcement questions, and that is Jean-Paul Nadeau, who you might see at the bottom of your screen. And so I'm going to hand it over to Emily, and I think I can count on Maggie and Mustafa to make sure that they are able to get their presentation on the screen. That's something I could never figure out.
Thank you, Shelley. So sorry, Carola. Just before we get into the presentation from Carola and her team, I will just quickly go over the Q&A portion of tonight's meeting, so folks know where to post questions, how to raise hands, and all that good stuff. So we will be using the live question function from WebEx. There are 2 ways you can ask your question. On the bottom right corner, right above the Q&A bar, you will see a hand icon as shown on this slide. If you have any questions during Carola's presentation, you can raise your hand, and a staff member will record that you have a question. And once we get to your question, we'll unmute your microphone. And then if you feel like your question has been answered throughout the presentation, you can click the icon again to put down your hand. Alternatively, you can also type in, I'd like to ask a question in the actual Q&A box at the bottom right corner of WebEx. Or if it's a short question that can be accommodated by 240 characters, you can type it into the Q&A box. If you are on a mobile or phone device, the raise hand function it takes a few more steps. You just have to click on the three dots at the bottom of the screen and it will show the Q&A. Similarly, you can type a quick question or indicate you'd like to speak. Or on the top right corner, you see an icon of a person. Once you click on that, you see the raise your hand function. We'll go back to it once Carola has finished her presentation, but this is how we'll be taking questions tonight. Thank you. And Carola, you should have a presenter role
to share your I'm going to do that. Yes. I'm about to do that right now. Thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Carola Presbook. I'm a senior planner in city planning, and I'm one of the team members on the multi-tenant housing review team. It is an interdivisional collaborative project. So we're here tonight to talk to you about a new regulatory framework for multi-tenant houses, which we also like to refer to as MTH, because multi-tenant houses can be quite a mouthful. So just briefly, for those of you who don't know, multi-tenant houses are one of the most affordable options in the private rental market. They provide living accommodation to residents in single rooms, and these can have shared kitchens and shared bathrooms, sometimes both. And they provide homes to diverse communities across our city. So we typically refer to some of the groups that are frequently tenants in multi-tenant houses as seniors, students, newcomers to the city, as well as residents in our city who have low to moderate incomes. We can see how affordable multi-tenant houses actually are when we look at what the average monthly rent is for a bachelor apartment in Toronto, which at last check was about $1,400 a month. And then looking at the rent for a room, the average rent for a room in a multi-tenant house is somewhere in the range of $400 to $700. So as the councillor was describing, this is a level of affordability that we sometimes refer to as deeply affordable. These tend to be deeply affordable options of housing. So in terms of some of the ways that the city regulates multi-tenant houses currently, we have zoning, which sets out where this use is permitted and what standards apply to it. So things like setbacks, parking, and any other land use conditions we want to put on the use. The city also licenses multi-tenant houses, and this is to ensure that they are safe and also well maintained. The current regulations that we have in the city for multi-tenant houses for both licensing and zoning are inconsistent in the way that they apply across the city. And so just to describe some of that inconsistency a little further, if we look at the various former municipalities that we have in our city, we have in the former city of Toronto, they are permitted under the zoning bylaw, and they also need to be licensed. If we look at the former city of York, they're permitted in some areas, but they do not require a license. And then in the former city of Etobicoke, they're also permitted only in some areas, but they do need a license in that location. And then looking at East York, North York, and Scarborough, they are not permitted at all by the zoning bylaw. So this map illustrates what I just described in terms of the zoning permissions. You can see that the concentration of permissions is in the former city of Toronto. And we know that there are approximately 350 licensed multi-tenant houses in Toronto. And so outside of those areas shown on the map, so all the areas shown in white, wherever multi-tenant houses exist, they are not permitted and they cannot be licensed. And these unlicensed and illegal multi-tenant houses, unfortunately, can result in conditions for the tenants that are unsafe and inadequate, as well as property maintenance and nuisance issues for the neighbors and communities in which they're located. Part of the problem being that we can only apply licensing to multi-tenant houses in areas where they're permitted by zoning. So if you look at the map, the vast majority of the city, which is shown in white, we cannot license or regulate multi-tenant houses because they're not permitted at all. So in terms of some of the other sort of elements of context or background that we took into consideration when undertaking this review, we have fire and life safety issues, and that's predominantly to tenants, for the tenants, but also maybe for some neighbors as well. We have the recently adopted by Council Housing TO action plan that was adopted in 2019, which calls for the protection of multi-tenant houses. We also know that there is a high demand in the city for affordable housing. We also have complaints from both tenants and neighbors alike in terms of property maintenance and other concerns. And we have other city policies such as our official plan and poverty reduction strategy. So these are all elements that we had to consider when undertaking this review. Just to get into a little bit more detail in one of the context elements that was on the previous slide, we have consideration for human rights. And as part of that recently adopted Housing TO action plan that I referenced, which was adopted by Council in December of 2019, we have a new Toronto Housing Charter. And this Toronto Housing Charter basically declared that Council and the city is adopting a human rights-based approach to housing. So this framework was developed using that lens in terms of looking at this, in terms of trying to provide housing that is safe, affordable, equitable, and accessible to everyone, or to all the tenants, while also trying to balance the need we know is there in terms of compliance and enforcement of the regulations. Sorry, my slide is okay. So the proposed framework that was taken to committee this past week has 5 parts to it. And we think that in combination, these 5 elements are going to encourage and regulate multi-tenant houses across the city that are safe and well-maintained and affordable. So these elements, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail in the next couple slides, are enhanced licensing requirements, an enforcement and compliance program, citywide zoning standards, some initiatives to support tenants as well as maintaining housing affordability, and the last piece being a phased implementation plan. So now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Emma from Municipal Licensing and Standards. She's going to talk about the first couple components of the framework.
Thanks, Paula. So as mentioned, I'm a policy officer with the city's Municipal Licensing and Standards Division. And also, as Corolla mentioned, the city does license multi-tenant houses in certain areas of the city to ensure safe and well-maintained homes. So the city is recommending enhanced licensing requirements for multi-tenant house operators to further support these goals as we move this framework citywide. So the proposed changes that are being recommended, first, that new multi-tenant house operators would be required to obtain a zoning review and building permit review to demonstrate compliance with both zoning bylaws and the building code. Next, currently there are different definitions of multi-tenant house in these separate bylaws. So the city is recommending to harmonize these definitions to ensure consistency and to support our enforcement efforts. So the new licensing definition is a building with 4 or more dwelling rooms that may have shared washrooms and cooking facilities and that does not function as a single housekeeping unit. Next, the city is recommending that multi-tenant house operators would be required to submit floor plans, and this would be to help with inspections and investigations, and these would not need to be engineered drawings or anything, just accurate drawings of the home. Next, we know that electrical safety is a particular concern in multi-tenant houses because many of the buildings are within buildings that have been converted from the previous use. And so the city is recommending that larger homes with 10 or more rooms or units would be required to undertake an electrical evaluation by a licensed electrical contractor upon application of a new license, and as well to maintain logs of service conducted to the electrical system. So next slide. So the city is also recommending that multi-tenant house operators would be required to develop a property maintenance plan that would address waste and pest management issues, and as well as include a process for landlords to respond to tenant concerns. We think this is a really important requirement because we do know that there are concerns from neighbors in terms of these houses maintaining property standards. Next, staff are recommending a requirement for operators to provide a record of the number of tenants living in the home. Previously, staff had considered recommendations related to insurance and a security deposit, but after consultation with operators and doing some additional research, we aren't recommending that operators be required to have liability insurance or include or provide a security deposit. We're instead recommending other enforcement tools that would be more effective at maintaining property standards for these homes. Next slide, please. So can you go to the next one? Thank you. So personal care and multi-tenant homes are a particular class of multi-tenant house, and they provide meals and additional support services to residents such as housekeeping, laundry, and medication storage. And so the city is also recommending a series of enhanced requirements for personal care and multi-tenant houses. And these would include training and qualifications for operators and persons in charge, minimum standards for staffing and cleaning, as well as standards to ensure landlords can provide tenants with the necessary personal care services, as well as standards for safe storage and access to prescription drugs, improved standards for meal plans and food premise inspections, and lastly, new requirements for operators to maintain records of any emergencies or incidents and provide those records to the city upon request. And so the next part of the framework is compliance and education programs. So as part of this proposed regulatory framework, we are proposing a four-part approach to support compliance and enforcement. So first, that will involve a dedicated enforcement team within municipal licensing and standards. And that team will work alongside staff in fire services, Toronto Building, Toronto Public Health, and other divisions as needed. Next, we are also proposing to enhance our education and outreach. So this will involve identifying unlicensed operators and notifying them of the new bylaw requirements, as well as providing education and support to tenants, operators, owners, as well as communities more broadly. Next, to support compliance of multi-tenant homes with our new licensing requirements, the city will be undertaking annual inspections of all licensed multi-tenant houses, as well as conducting investigations into any unlicensed operators. And next, enforcement, is a particular concern with this new strategy. So we are recommending increased fines as well as a modernized housing tribunal and the ability for the city to undertake remedial action in cases where property owners have not kept up their property. And in these cases, the city can undertake the action and then put that cost back on the tax roll of the property owner. So at this point, I'll pass it back to Carola, who will go through the citywide zoning strategy.
Thanks, Emma. So much like the licensing bylaw, we are proposing as part of the new zoning bylaw to have new definitions for multi-tenant house and dwelling room, and these would be consistent. So they would bring all of the existing inconsistent definitions into conformity with each other, and they would be more or less aligned with what the licensing definition is, because currently they are not aligned, which can make enforcement problematic at times. So in terms of a dwelling room, we're proposing that that be defined as a room which is used for living accommodation, and it's available for rent, and it is not self-contained. So that is really the key there. It's not self-contained. It can contain a private washroom or a kitchen, but not both. So if you were to have a room that had both a kitchen and a bathroom in it, that would be a dwelling unit and not a dwelling room anymore. In terms of a multi-tenant house, we're proposing that the definition be a building with 4 or more of these dwelling rooms as defined, and it may have a shared washroom and a shared kitchen. So in terms of the proposal itself, we're proposing that multi-tenant houses would now be permitted in all zones across the city. that permit residential uses, and they would be subject to certain conditions. Probably the most significant of those is that we are proposing that in order to control the intensity of the use, that there be a maximum number of rooms permitted in a multi-tenant house depending on the zone. So most residential neighborhoods in the city, such as the RD zones, the RS zones, the RT zones, the maximum number of rooms permitted would be 6. If you have a higher density residential zone, such as a residential apartment zone, we're proposing the maximum number of rooms would be 12. And then if you move into the highest density commercial residential zones, which are typically found along arterial roads in the city, these are the mixed use areas, so they're no longer really residential neighborhoods. We're proposing the maximum would be 25. And an important thing to point out with respect to the maximum number of rooms is that it's a maximum. So it would also need to comply with the minimum room size standards that are found in the Ontario Building Code, as well as the property standards bylaw. So if you have a smaller home, you may not be able to accommodate 6 rooms. So it would be whatever you could accommodate, still subject to those other requirements. And in terms of the types of buildings that these would be permitted in, if you're in a zone such as an RD zone that only permits single-family detached houses, it would be permitted to convert a single-family detached house into one of these multi-tenant houses, and the same would be true for a semi-detached, or if you're in a zone that permits townhouses, you could convert one of those into having dwelling room accommodation and being a multi-tenant house. But another important element to point out in that regard is that a multi-tenant house would still have to comply with all of the standards for that zone. So for example, if the maximum height is 10 and the maximum density is 0.6, that multi-tenant house would also have to comply with those regulations. And that's intended to ensure that multi-tenant houses are maintaining the built form character of any given neighborhood. So in terms of permitting this use citywide, we feel that this supports and conforms with the official plan policies, which encourage the provision of different types of housing in all neighborhoods, as well as different types of affordable housing across the city. And it's also consistent with the city's approach in terms of human rights. And so another element that might be of interest in terms of the zoning approach is parking. So we've looked at parking, and that the parking for multi-tenant houses would be based on transit access. So if you're in an area of the city that's really well served by transit, such as the downtown, a multi-tenant house with 6 rooms, as an example, would require no parking spaces. However, if you're in a part of the city that is not well served by transit, in this example, if you had a multi-tenant house with 6 rooms, you would require a minimum of 2 parking spaces. And so a couple things to point out on that. In terms of the proximity to transit, the way it's currently measured, you would have to be pretty much on top of the transit line in order to be considered transit accessible. So the very large majority of all the residential areas would be in the second group, so they would not be considered well served by transit. They would require the parking. And the other element to point out is that this is a minimum requirement. So there's nothing to prevent a property owner from providing additional parking, provided that they can still meet their minimum landscape requirements on their lot. So I'm also going to touch on the 4th component of the framework, which is something that our colleagues in the Housing Secretariat have developed. So on the left-hand side, we're calling it concerns. So these are some of the things we heard throughout the consultation, and then what's being recommended in order to address some of those. So obviously, there's a lot of new licensing regulations being proposed, and a lot of these have potential cost implications on operators if they want to comply. So things like complying with the Ontario Building Code might require retrofits and renovations to their buildings. And there's the fear that this additional cost was going to be trickled down to the tenants in terms of increased rents that maybe make the units or the rooms no longer affordable. So some of the things that are being recommended in this report, which is going to council, is that Toronto Buildings is going to hire a consultant to look at other options and more cost-effective ways in which some of these operators may be able to comply with both the Ontario Building Code as well as the Fire Code in order to reduce some of the cost. And then the city is also looking at a financial incentive program for eligible operators to offset some of these costs. So it's important to note that this would only be to eligible operators, and this would likely be tied to some level of having to maintain an affordable rent. So this would not be an incentive program that would be provided to operators who are charging really high rents for rooms and making a lot of money off of their operations. It would be tied to the operators somehow maintaining through an agreement with the city the affordable rents as a condition of having this incentive provided to them. We also heard that there are some concerns with respect to possible tenant displacements as a result of the proposed maximum number of rooms. So for example, there may be an illegal multi-tenant house currently where the maximum number of rooms is greater than 6, and they're located in an area where we're proposing that only 6 rooms be permitted. So in order to come into compliance, that operator would either have to come to the city and ask for a special permission either through a rezoning application or minor variance to have a larger number of rooms, or they would have to reduce the number of rooms they have in their home. So realizing that this compliance may result in some tenants being displaced, the Housing Secretariat, as part of the phased implementation plan, is going to take a proactive approach to planning for emergency relocations as well as potential displacements. And I guess the emergency relocations is more related to if we had to close down a home because there was a threat to life safety upon inspection. And then lastly, one of the concerns we heard is that the new zoning bylaw, in terms of permitting the use in areas of the city where it currently isn't permitted, would just result in areas around post-secondary institutions being more crowded with student housing in their neighborhoods. So one of the things that we have already started doing in order to try and address this is accelerating the discussions we already had ongoing with post-secondary institutions in the city in order to try and figure out ways that we can develop additional affordable student housing on or near their campuses. And this would likely involve some sort of partnership either with the city or with other levels of government. And then I'm just going to pass it over to Emma one more time for the last slides on implementation.
Thanks, Corolla. So we know that these are significant changes that we're proposing, and we want to be able to do it right. So that said, the city's developed an overall implementation plan and a phased approach to ensure a smooth and orderly transition to the new framework. And this implementation will take place over at least 3 years to ensure that we have time, again, to do it right. So within the first year, which will be from September 2021 to November 2022, one of the most important steps will be to create a larger and dedicated enforcement team, as well as a project management team across city divisions to facilitate that interdivisional work. We will also be updating our housing tribunal and then doing various other system changes. During the next year, year 2, that is when our zoning and our licensing bylaws are recommended to come into effect, November 1, 2022. And at that point, there'll be a significant push for outreach and education to just tell people about the new regulations. We'll also focus our enforcement on high-risk operators and transitioning currently licensed operators to the new framework, as well as identifying and transitioning currently operating unlicensed operators to the new framework. And then following that in year 3, that's when we will focus on licensing new operators, and as well throughout the process we'll be monitoring impacts on housing affordability, communities, and tenants. So next slide. And then also throughout implementation, staff will continue to put tenants and communities first. And that will be by promoting safe and livable houses, as I said, identifying high-risk operators, and then taking enforcement action to address immediate risks to life and safety. And lastly, mitigating any negative impacts on neighborhoods and third parties. So that concludes our staff presentation. At this point, I will pass it back to Councillor Carroll.
Thank you, Corolla. Thank you, Emma, for the presentation.
Getting my video image back there. Okay, so thank you for that presentation. That really takes you through a lot of what the council has seen. I'm wondering, we probably will get questions about enforcement right off the bat. And so Officer Nadeau will be able to field those. But I was wondering, Jean-Paul, if you wanted to say a couple of words about what would be entailed in you having a better enforcement team right off the bat, because I know that's where a lot of the community's concerns would be.
Thank you, Councillor. I appreciate that. Currently, as it stands, since July of 2020, Municipal Licensing and Standards has put together a dedicated enforcement team to deal with multi-tenanted houses. This team was started in July of 2020, and we currently have a little over 350 licensed rooming houses under our portfolio, which include personal care rooming houses. Our team also deals with group homes, although group homes are not included in this particular regime that is being projected. So we've had over a year in order to become very familiar on how to deal with licensed rooming houses. We've also gotten really close with a number of our colleagues in Toronto Fire, Toronto Police, Toronto Buildings, and Public Health as well. With that being in mind, we've also had extensive experience in dealing with illegal rooming houses throughout the city of Toronto, and dealing with the different zoning bylaws that we currently have to deal with. As it stands right now, our officers have to enforce the zoning bylaw for any illegal rooming house corresponding to the actual area that it's in. As an example, Etobicoke, North York, or Scarborough. As opposed to a uniform zoning bylaw that we're looking at trying to achieve with this particular project. We've dealt with a number of different communities that have brought forward their issues. We understand where their concerns are. We've gotten a pretty wide base in terms of what complaints have come in. We're familiar with what a lot of communities are concerned with, and we've tried to refine our ability in dealing with these specific issues and communicating with the community. All of the complaints that come in, we take a look at the complaint, we have a conversation with the complainant, we do extensive research on the particular property with the databases that we have before we even actually attend the property. And then when we do attend the property, we deal with it from an enforcement perspective, but also through an educational program, because not every complaint that comes in for a rooming house is an actual rooming house. And then if we need to deal with it, we deal with it through our different enforcement tools that we currently have. And I'll probably just lead into the question that came in. So currently we do have a number of enforcement issues that we've had over a number of years, one of them being the fact that the zoning bylaw that we're enforcing for complaints as they come in could be any number of different bylaws. So it is difficult for us to be consistent and try to make sure that we have the appropriate information in order to go forward with any type of enforcement. It also makes it quite difficult to educate the public, because we have to consistently go back and do research as to what the issues are. So by having a one zoning bylaw to deal with would make it a lot simpler for us to educate the public. There is a number of issues in terms of entering properties. One of the issues that we typically have is the fact that most tenants are very fearful of us. And the reason why they're fearful of us is because currently, as it stands, there's no avenue for owners to become licensed. So when we do our enforcement, as an example, let's say Scarborough, you're only allowed to have 2 tenants. At which point in time, if you encounter a dwelling that has 6 people, that means 4 people have to leave. And that provides a bit of an issue where if we do enforcement and we do enforce the zoning bylaw, as it is to occupancy, those 4 people have to vacate the property in order to become compliant. If they are members of the community, then ideally they're going to want to stay within that community. So the chances of them going into another dwelling that potentially is illegal is very high, at which point in time, the second time around, they're less likely to invite us in because they know the consequences in doing so. So with properties being capable of being licensed, it allows us an opportunity to give owners an avenue to become licensed, which then builds the confidence level in a lot of tenants in order to reach out to us when they have issues. It also makes it a lot easier for us to actually enter because they're less likely to be evicted. And in terms of the complaints that we typically receive, as it stands right now, when it comes up to the average illegal rooming house, we typically get long grass and weeds. We get cars parked on the front lawn, or a number of cars parked over a widened driveway, or general maintenance of the property or waste becoming an issue. As it stands right now, through my experience over the last year with dealing with licensed rooming houses, those particular issues are less likely, and it's for a number of reasons. One of them being is that there is a set of expectations that they have for them through the rooming house bylaw that we currently have, but we also maintain an annual inspection with ourselves, Toronto Fire, and Public Health if need be. So there is a set of expectations, and if they fail to meet those expectations, currently as it stands, we have a tribunal on top of our bylaws. So we have a number of different avenues of dealing with this particular problem. So we don't need to go to court as often, which is great because we all know that the court system tends to be a little long. But as it stands, those are a majority of the challenges that we have. So hopefully that addresses the Q&A that's there and also introduces what we do. Thank you for your time.
So Jean-Paul, those inspections of the licensed rooming houses, are they always announced, or can the annual inspection be unannounced? If you think that you've got a bad operator, can you do a surprise inspection so that they're not able to clean up their act just because you're coming?
You know, that's a very good question. We can do that. Have we needed to? Not to my knowledge. The typical reasoning for, or the typical plan is that the property owner has a renewal that is sent to them. They have to fill out their application if any information has changed, at which point in time, once we receive all that information, we then arrange for an inspection with our department to go in there and do a full exterior and a full interior inspection. And at which point in time, Toronto Fire goes on their own, but they do a very similar inspection. Public Health does the same thing if it's a personal care rooming house. But when we go in there, we're normally welcomed in terms of going in there and dealing with it. And many property owners want to be on site in order to go through any issues that we may have with the property. And then if they're minor issues, we'll point out the issues and we'll advise them as a timeline. If they're serious issues, then we'll issue property standards orders. And if they go beyond that, then we can deal with it. But to answer your question, yes, we could. If we find that a property owner is not being truthful in terms of how many tenants they have, or whether or not specific rooms are storage rooms or they're actually bedrooms when we're not there, we do have the authority to attend unannounced. But with that being in mind, we still have someone's dwelling, so we still need to get permission from the residents in order to enter to do our interior inspections, not the exterior.
Okay. This might be a good place because you mentioned we can, but we don't have to. I should probably go into some of the history in the area where rooming houses are licensed. Some of the history. Councillor Perks got a shirt and a knot that that it wasn't that the Parkdale pilot wasn't described in detail. Well, you know, because he lived it, but also because he thinks it would really demonstrate something to a community like ours, and yet we didn't get to it. I think it's probably because a lot of the staff working on this on from the policy shop are a bit younger, and so you know eventually in committee they said tell us what it is. So I just want to go over it for my residents because it is the thing that makes me torn. I know this is a very difficult thing for our community. So I haven't even made up my mind yet. I'm waiting to see what all the changes are. I think so is Mayor Tory. But this is the compelling piece for me. That where the rooming houses are licensable is downtown. The popular areas where they're concentrated, staff can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a real concentration of them in the downtown West End, Parkdale in particular, then another in the East End. In Parkdale, where it seemed as if there were a lot of illegal operators around the time of amalgamation, it was 1999, 2000, somewhere around there, there was a pilot project started to aggressively, intensely enforce and bring everyone into compliance. And that was about the time it was decided we continue to have legal and licensed rooming houses. Post amalgamation, we're going to leave things in place in some places, but we're going to allow licensing in some places. And in Parkdale, there was a properly resourcing the enforcement and the assistance with compliance, assisting the owners to comply, because that type of housing was needed for some people. They can't get onto the social housing list in a timely fashion, but they certainly can't afford anything over 1,000. So something was needed. So they did really concentrated enforcement to get to where there would be no illegal rooming houses, just licensed ones. And they were able to do that and sort of stabilize the concept of the licensed rooming house. One would have thought that, you know, having made it easier for an operator to come into compliance and operate a rooming house, that you'd end up with 100,000 of them. After 25 years, there are still only 350 in the whole of the downtown. And the stabilizing of it from the pilot project is such that the initiative that's gone on for the last couple of years is the Parkdale community has an initiative called Save Our Rooming Houses. That kind of speaks to me. I can't imagine in Don Valley North all of you mobilizing to say save my rooming house at the end of my block. In a regulated, licensed regime with proper enforcement, we now have residents saying, no, I'd rather have my properly run rooming house than yet another condo tower. And so they have a Save Our Rooming Houses initiative going on. And so that gives me pause. I have to stop and say, well, something went right there. and so Jean-Paul has gone a long way to describing, you know, the careful regime they are able to have in place when they have licensed houses. And that's perhaps why you have that sentiment from those residents. So it really gives you something to think about. But I also know that in order to do that, a huge investment was made to make sure that pilot project gave that enforcement team the ability to really go at finding the, you know, rooming house operating the basement of a restaurant, you know, situations like that were able to be taken care of. So, you know, it's just something to think about. And it gives you an idea of numbers. If you think of having them legal for 25 years across that span, they have 350 licenses and the illegal ones closing down. So it's something to think about. Now, the Q&A section, if you've found the Q&A button, you can type your questions in there. Maggie, you may want to go over the raise your hand rules again, and then I will just touch on one more point and we'll see if people have brought in feedback, unless you have one now.
Thank you, Shelley. So I will go over the Q&A function and the raise your hand function again. Just sharing my screen here.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. So on WebEx, on the right-hand corner, there's a column And right above the Q&A bar, you should be able to see a hand button, a hand icon, and you can click on the icon to raise your hand to ask a question live, or you can type in the Q&A box, I'd like to ask a question, and then we'll put you in the question queue. Alternatively, you can type a short question into the Q&A box. The reason for short questions is because it has a character limit. So if you have a longer question, the live function might be the best option here. And if you're operating on a phone or a tablet, you can just type on the top right-hand corner on the person icon, and the raise hand function should be visible to you after that. We do have some questions. Let me just stop sharing my screen here.
So I wonder if I can just ask one more question of the policy staff, and then we'll go to those questions. I just want to, I'm preemptively asking it. It may be the question, but I'm looking at the list of attendees, and I can tell by looking at the names that we have a number of attendees that live in townhouses, and that's been a question that is floating around out there. And I think it's because of the map. People see the map and the different zones in it that are in the presentation. So I'm wondering if Emma and Carola can tell us in the proposal that staff have right now, when we're talking about single families can be licensed to be a rooming house, does that include a townhouse? If it is an owned condominium townhouse, would they also be able to apply for a rooming house license?
So in terms of the zoning, we are proposing that multi-tenant, a townhouse could be converted into a multi-tenant house. Primarily, these are found in zones where the maximum number would be 6. And I think it's important to note a couple things. One being that 6 is a limit, an upper limit. So again, you know, if it's a smaller townhouse or a smaller single detached house for that matter, they would still need to comply with the minimum room sizes that are required. So maybe a small townhouse or a small house would not be able to accommodate 6 rooms and meet those standards. So maybe they could only do 4 or 5. And then the other important thing to point out is that if it is a condominium situation, we know that a condominium corporation, through their declarations, can choose to be more restrictive than the zoning bylaws. So we saw this with short-term rentals. So even though in the zoning bylaw now we are allowed to have short-term rentals in a lot of areas, some condominium corporations have chosen to be more restrictive and to prohibit short-term rentals in their
so that
condominium
would
corporation.
Here as well. So for instance, I don't have to move a motion. I see places on the map right now because you basically used apartment neighborhood guidelines. I see places on the map where Don Valley North has townhouses, and from the looks of the map, it looks like that it might be possible to consider a 12 dwelling room rooming house, but they still have to go through the licensing process, at which point you would say, no, you can't have 12 dwelling rooms in a 3-bedroom townhouse. They would have to meet the standards in order to make that possible, and the answer would be no. Am I saying that right?
So I'll defer to Emma, but yes, as part of the licensing, they would be reviewing for compliance with the Ontario Building Code.
Okay, I'm just anticipating that question, Maggie, but throwing it open now. Tell us what else we have.
Thank you, Shelley. So we do have a lot of questions coming in written, so we'll just go from top to bottom. The first one is, what are the areas that are currently licensed areas? Can you cite a few? How successful or unsuccessful are they in terms of enforcement?
Paul pretty much answered that, but if you just want to briefly go over again, where is it legal now that people could look at?
Sorry, I was on mute there. Currently, it's basically in the downtown core, moving up towards the south end of Etobicoke, and there's a couple of places throughout Etobicoke along the main corridor that are currently licensed. As Carola said, everywhere else it's not permitted.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. And as we've said, they're pretty much under control now. There are 300 licenses, 350, I should say, licenses, and the issue of illegal rooming houses pretty much under control. Am I right in reflecting the comments at committee?
Yes, briefly looking at the statistics that I have available, the problems in terms of illegal rooming houses in the licensed area is extremely few and far between.
Okay, thank you. Maggie?
Thank you. Our next question is, many of the complaints we hear about that are site-specific are ill-kept homes, creating rat infestation, garbage thrown around, parking violations, etc., without adequate enforcement. Any amount of licensing is not going to help. Our concern is changing zoning and licensing is going to create more problems.
So if I can just set this up for you guys to talk about, this is commonly what gets MLS called out to properties, and it's always reported as a rooming house. Sometimes it turns out to be different situations going on, but it is a problem. The proposal as it stands today, are you confident that you know, in going out to follow up, you know, say council adopts this, um, you've got a year in which you're working to get ready for the bylaw to come into effect. During that year, what if someone phones and says, this is what's going on at my house next door? How would that be addressed? Will people continue to have the response and the service to come and address a problem like that?
So perhaps I'll start. Oh, sorry, go JP, you start.
No, go ahead, Emma.
Yeah, so I'll start off and then I'll hand it off to JP. So up until our licensing bylaw and zoning bylaws come into effect, we're proposing November 1, 2022. It would be, John Paul's team would still be actively enforcing as they are now. We are proposing to employ additional bylaw officers beginning in 2022. There is a bit of a process in terms of hiring and training those officers, but we are proposing to expand our dedicated enforcement team, which will help with those enforcement issues that you've spoken to. We know enforcement is an issue, but we also know that currently we do have issues and it's illegal, and we think that the status quo is simply not working. So that's why we're bringing this proposal forward. Some of the things that we are proposing that will come into effect with our zoning and licensing bylaws that we think will really make an impact. First, we're proposing enhanced enforcement tools in addition to expanding the enforcement team. We'll have increased fines, a better housing tribunal through which we can bring operators to the tribunal and place conditions on their license. As well, we'll have the ability to undertake remedial action in cases where operators don't do the work themselves. And in addition to that, one of the licensing requirements will be for operators to do a property maintenance plan and implement that plan. And that plan will specifically address waste issues, long grass and weeds, and pest management issues, which you cited in your question. So we think with those measures in place, we will be able to do a better job at enforcing, because we'll have additional tools and additional resources to help John Paul and his team.
Mm-hmm. John Paul, you want to add that?
I think Emma explained it quite well. I don't think I need to add anything anymore on that one. Thank you, Emma.
It's very tricky because this question, because you know we keep hearing that saying nothing's working now. No amount of licensing is going to make it work. And I think what that is people think there is a mild amount of this regulatory framework in place, and it just making it stronger won't work. But the issue here is there is no framework. There is nothing, and so they've moved into a space that is, you know, we are the wild, wild west, if I can use that old saying. I will say this though. Part of what the person questioning is asking really leads to my issue with I'm just really not there yet based on the financial impacts. I just want to go over that a little bit because I'm going to need you to back me up on this. If this is where we end up, I'll tell you right now. This is the conversation that I'm going to have with Mayor John Tory. One of the ways that I approach any report was taught to me by a veteran counselor as I came in the door, Counselor Kyle Ray. He said, you know, you're going to have mountains of reports, and I know you're committed. I know you think you can read every one of them, but you can't. So when we're doing something in the city and you know it's going to affect your ward, read the summary very thoroughly. Read the recommendations. Are they crystal clear, and do they tell you everything you need to know? Then read the financial impact, because not only do you want to keep an eye on the dollars and cents and know whether or not you know, we're keeping taxes down. Sometimes you're looking at, are they really going to do all the things in those recommendations? Because what would be the price tag? The financial impact the box here doesn't seem to have enough dollars in it to do the things they're promising. That you look for that, and then lastly you go down and read the summary. And if by the end of that exercise the hair is standing up on the back of your neck, then you go back and do the backstroke through the whole report. And in this one, there are 49 recommendations. I believe there are 50 now because the Planning and Housing Committee added a couple. Read all of those. A lot is being committed to, and clear definitions are embedded in the recommendations so that everybody can be clear from the get-go about what they're proposing to do. And then I get to the financial impact, and we're looking at about $3.5 million eventually, still under five. At the end of the day, about $5 million. So here's my problem with that. You know, when one of our towers down on Shepherd Avenue gets built and we want to put in affordable housing units, if I want to add just 20 affordable housing units, it can cost upwards of $8 million to secure and pay for that. If we're going to end up with this, getting between Scarborough and North York 350 rooming houses with 6 affordable units in each, shouldn't we be spending at least $8 million? Doesn't that make sense? My feeling is, I don't see this working for our neighborhood unless we take the first 3 years and front end load it. I don't want to wait. I don't want everybody to be new on the job in 2022 if this goes ahead. I want the hiring to start now, the training to be lengthy and can be used to go around data banking. How many houses are we talking about here? And be ready at implementation to really keep the commitment to you that allowing legal operators is going to wind down illegal operators and still leave people with places to live. And I just don't see us setting the budget for that over the 3 years. I think if you sort of front end well resource this, the city's growing fast. By the time you're done needing them because you have your new normal, there will be places that those bylaw officers can be enforcing, other needs of the city. They wouldn't be a waste. There would be work for them to do. But it's one of the things that I'm looking at, because what the questioner described, I think we're going to find a lot of that. If council does this, you're all going to call me right away and tell me about ones that I might not have on my list of suspected rooming houses. I do have one here in the office. So does city staff. You may add to that list, and all of them will have to be followed up on. And if they have those things that we just heard, rat infestations, chronic, parking on the grass, some people hanging out over the boulevard and the sidewalk, just the parking infractions, but the MLS property standards infractions, things like that, that suddenly the floodgate will open and they'll all need to be followed up on. You're going to want me to make sure there's someone to follow them up. And so, it's one of the outstanding concerns for me. It's one of the things that we got to figure out before we're voting on this in council. Absolutely. I'm going to need comforting answers on that, because I want to address each and every one of those, whether it's a rooming house or just a difficult tenant or a hoarding situation, this could springboard to us dealing with a lot of the multitude of things that our bylaw enforcement officers are dealing with in property enforcement. Maggie, you want to move on to the next question?
Yes, so we're gonna do one more written one. So just a reminder for all the meeting attendees that we are utilizing the raise hand function on WebEx, so you can ask a question live, and it can be found at the right-hand corner of the bottom right-hand corner of the WebEx platform, just above the Q&A section. If you would like to speak, you can also type in the chat box or the Q&A box. I'd like to speak to the issue. So again, you can raise your hand in the platform to ask a question live, or you can type in the box. So our next question is, will you be allowing rooming houses to pave over their front yards to provide additional parking spaces?
Very good question.
Yeah, good question.
Go ahead.
So in terms of what we're proposing currently with the minimum, as the example, if you have 6 rooms in a multi-tenant house, the need for a minimum of 2 parking spaces. In addition to, examining other municipalities in North America in terms of their parking rates and other similar uses in Toronto, one of the reasons, we thought number 2 or a minimum of 2 was a good number is because it is a number that can be reasonably accommodated on the majority of residential properties in the city. Because obviously we don't want people to pave over their front lawns to provide parking. So that would be in contravention to other aspects of the zoning bylaw, such as the requirement for soft landscaping. And those are, obviously for different reasons in terms of having areas for stormwater runoff to percolate back into the ground and offset other environmental concerns. So we definitely do not want to see people paving over their front yards to provide additional parking. Now, that being said, an owner could potentially go to, the committee of adjustment, just like any other owner is entitled to put forward a proposal for the property that would be considered. But that is not something that I would suggest staff would support in terms of paving over their front yard.
So currently, we're very lucky in that regard. Currently, our area, we're north of the 401 and we're North York Community Council area. And so parking pads do not get considered in a committee of adjustment. And when they come to North York Community Council, we say no to them there as well. We don't get applications from our area, but because North York Community Council includes parts of the former East York Leaside and parts of the former City of York, we do deal with parking pad applications at Community Council, but never from this area because of we follow the landscape versus paving recommendations to the letter. So those statutes are still in place. They would stay in place.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Maggie?
Thank you. I was just made aware of the raise hand function is also visible if you hover over your own name. The attendees, you should be able to see your own name as well if you close the Q&A, just in case you had trouble accessing it from the previous method. Our next question is, what about the condo complexes who have a declaration indicating single-family dwellings? How do we ensure that our owners are not rooming houses? Last time it took me 2 years to get rid of them.
Yeah, so this was the question I was telling you about. We have a lot of those. Our staff, thank you for the question, because our staff may not know about this. Part of the reason that we asked this question here, and we're so nervous about it in Don Valley North, is that Don Valley North was actually the first neighborhood in North York. We have the first condominium attached townhome complexes, and they're defined as single family dwellings. And so So they are quite nervous about this. Getting them closed down before was difficult because they're, it's the same powers of entry and difficulty. And so you're hearing about someone who had a really difficult time with one. So if you want to just repeat that answer, they would have the ability to use their Condo Corporation Act to say, not here, no license in our complex.
Yeah, I know this came up with short-term rentals that that condominium corporations through their declarations have the ability to be more restrictive than the zoning bylaw. They cannot be less restrictive than the zoning bylaw. So if the zoning bylaw says you can't do something, the condo corporation can't override that. But there is the ability to be more restrictive than the zoning bylaw. So a condo corporation could decide that they do not want to allow, for example, short-term rentals, or that they do not want to allow multi-tenant houses in their declaration. But I would assume, I'm not sure, but in terms of enforcing that would be more of a civil, like a legal matter in term between the owners and or between the corporation and the offending owner. I'm not sure how that would work.
Yeah, and that is not for the questioner, Maggie. I'm not sure who it is, but I don't see that definitively in staff's report. And so that is something that I would nail down first in my conversations with the mayor before council, and again, if this thing is going through, we want that nailed down. And so I would add that if people are adding recommendations and it looks like the count is there that this is going to go through, I'm going to add that so that it becomes crystal clear. It will probably take Emma can correct me if she wants, but I should probably check with legal to make sure. But when you have something like that and you want to be very clear about it, and you go to legal and to the staff who've worked on this report to do it, they help you write the motion so that it's not open to interpretation, so that it becomes a very clear thing. So I'm writing that one down, and I'm between now and council, I'm going to get that one nailed down, because if you look at our map, that impact could happen in a number of places if we haven't been clear enough. Yeah.
Thank you. Our next question is, how do you find illegal rooming houses? And how would you incentivize illegal rooming house operators to become licensed, since they can simply continue such practice?
That's a very good question. We have a number of different techniques to identify rooming houses. I don't necessarily want to divulge them all in a public forum, but we do have a number of techniques that we have been successful in identifying. One of the things we often get as a complaint is people coming and going. Because a particular property happens to be very busy doesn't necessarily mean it is a rooming house. The individuals may in fact live very different lives amongst each other, but it's a matter of meeting the requirements currently as it stands in the zoning bylaw, and identifying if they're operating as a single housekeeping unit. So that's typically how we deal with that particular aspect. Can you just refresh the second part of that question, if you don't mind?
How would you incentivize illegal rooming house operators to become licensed, since they can simply continue such practice?
I think Emma could probably go into a little bit of detail on that. It deals a little bit less of the enforcement aspect in terms of other avenues that we will have available. Emma?
Yeah, thanks, John Paul. So in terms of how we incentivize operators, we don't have specific incentives, but we think that in our experience in the former city of Toronto, where they are legal, it is our experience that most operators do become licensed. And in cases where they are not licensed now, when John Paul's team goes to investigate them, they can use enforcement mechanisms to move those operators towards the license framework, because that's not currently an option for those operators currently.
Thank you. The next question is, how many strikes do owners/operators or tenants get before major actions such as eviction or the removal of the property takes place because of violation or amounting to permanently damaging the surrounding neighborhood?
That's a good question. It would be a case-by-case basis. My team has worked with other agencies such as Toronto Fire, where we've had to step in and close down rooming houses right away for health and safety concerns for either the community or for the residents inside. Uh, the idea is that we're always working towards compliance, because compliance typically is far easier to get than trying to get compliance through the court system. If you have a property owner that decides that the court system is going to be their avenue, it usually doesn't pan out very well, because of the fines. If we run into a problem property where the issue continues to happen, we can ask for stuff like probation orders, where they would be in breach of a court order if they continue to do the same offense. But as it stands right now, we're hoping that a lot of property owners will move towards the regime, mainly because of the fact that it would be far easier to go that route than to start taking on $100,000 fines and breach of court orders and all of that if we need to go that route. We have done that in the past, so we are capable of dealing with it that way if need be, but it's less likely.
And Jean-Paul, the questioner raised the issue of difficult tenants too. Currently, because the rooming house is totally illegal, the owner of it, if they have a problem tenant who's seriously into a criminal element or something like that, they don't actually have a lot of legal and procedural ways to evict them, do they? Because they've set up an illegal situation to begin with.
There are avenues that go that route, and that's where Toronto Police or the Landlord Tenant Board would probably be more of where that particular
But that would
issue
be in
would
a
go.
licensed house. Using the Landlord Tenant Board, that would only be in a licensed house. An illegal rooming house, can they use the Landlord Tribunal?
It is possible. I don't want to go into too much detail, because I don't know
Okay.
that as well as the bylaws, because that's a provincial enforcement issue. But as it
Okay.
stands, having a place that's licensed allows for both the owner, operator, and residents another avenue to address or mediate issues within the dwelling, and outside of what we are capable of enforcing, because we enforce the bylaws. If they have issues as privacy or financial issues or agreements that were made amongst each other, that avenue is allowed to them a lot more freely in a licensed format, as opposed to an illegal rooming house, through my experience.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time just for one or two more questions. Thank you guys who have written in. We do have a time limit. We'll try to get through as many as possible, but if we haven't gotten to yours, please feel free to email counselor_Carol@toronto.ca. So next question is, how many illegal rooming houses have been dealt with in the last year?
So currently we have enforced just under 100, where we've identified them as illegal rooming houses. We're in the process, we've already been issued them notices of violation, and they are on a list. But right now, it wouldn't be ethical for us to start enforcing it if council is potentially looking at legalizing it. So we're waiting upon council's decision before we decide what to do with those particular properties. There are more outside of that, but that's currently what we've identified over the last little while.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Just getting through. Sorry, guys. There's a lot of questions. I'm just trying to scroll to the newest one. So we have a question. Oh, yes, here we go. Why don't we have a choice in where these rooming houses are allowed? Can't we do it in the rest of the city and not just in North York?
So I would say, oh, sorry, go ahead. I would say just in terms of the zoning bylaw, there really is no, what city planning staff recommend in terms of zoning bylaw amendments have to have very specific land use reasons or land use impacts behind them. And we just can't think of any rationale or land use rationale in terms of not permitting this residential use on a geographic basis. And that's why we are recommending that they be permitted across the city, obviously subject to those limitations. And those limitations are intended to control the intensity of use so that they are consistent with the character of the existing buildings in those neighborhoods. And I'll let Emma talk about or add something.
Nothing to add. I think you covered it quite well, Chloe.
Yeah. One of the things that can't be ignored is that the growth of these illegal rooming houses in all three of the inner suburbs really starts out by being tied to that growth around the suburban campuses. And it can't be ignored that for North York, there's the biggest campus for Seneca College, and there is also York University. And so what starts as a neighborhood that might have a rooming house or two per street around the council or around the campus can sometimes grow until it also becomes an affordable housing option for newly settled Canadians. And they learn that those are the neighborhoods where they might find those opportunities. One of the things that the downtown councilors tell me that licensing does is then it makes it possible that they could actually be more spread out, that they don't have to be right beside the campus. Sure, there's a row of student dwellings that runs up and down Bathurst and across Harvard because they're really close to U of T. And so students can rent a room and share a kitchen with all the other students in the house. But in terms of, distinct dwelling room, almost purpose retrofitted or purpose-built houses like this, you begin to be able to disperse them. 350 houses across all of the downtown part of City of York and part of Etobicoke is really spreading them out. We don't want to have a whole street gone to rooming houses or a whole subdivision gone. And one of the things that licensing can do is make it possible to more evenly distribute those so that the neighborhood still holds a high value. Most of us moved out here in the 70s and 80s because it was more affordable place to have property than in the downtown. That property was too expensive. Well, the rooming houses were there then, and yet their real estate gets more and more expensive every day. So if we pull apart the property value, what you really want is a livable street. And if the dwelling is properly licensed, properly inspected annually, the tenants within it have so many rights that they can also walk up and down the street with their head held high as a neighbor. I'm a neighbor who lives here. I now have something in common with you. Roomers that live on your street can't do that right now. These are the things that the downtown councilors say to me are the benefits of licensing. For me, the issue is the transition. How can we make sure that if we're going to transition to this, that it can work? And if we're going to do that, I don't think we can say, just do it over there by Scarborough U of T, just do it out at Humber College, but leave North York with the concentration that's already near Seneca, already near, pardon me, leave what's happening near York unregulated and the continuing chaos that's there now. What you would end up with is them seeing their problem properties fixed, and we'd be left festering because our campuses aren't going away. So that's why they're recommending this, and those are the those are the sort of selling points that councillors who already represent these areas give to me in the licensed establishments, similar to what Jean-Paul was saying earlier in how he maintains them year after year. So that it gives us something to think about. If we isolated ourselves out, we'd be leaving ourselves with the status quo. And I know from what I hear from you every day, I don't think the status quo is something we can live with for very much longer.
Thank you, Shelley. We are just approaching our the end, but I think we can squeeze in one more question. So this will be our last question for this meeting. We all know the problems that happen in the Eglinton Mount Pleasant neighborhood where they needed homeless homes. I guess it's referring to the shelters. Is the city going to offer the same to rooming houses?
The same, sorry, can you say the beginning of the question again?
Yeah. We all know the problem that happened in the Eglinton Mount Pleasant neighborhood where they needed homeless homes.
Okay.
Is the city going to offer the same to rooming houses?
So I'm going to answer that one. I don't want to put these staff on the spot because the emergency shelters, the Roehampton Hotel and the annex building they used on Broadway, Edward Village in our own ward, these are pandemic-related emergency shelters for the homeless. And so they are under the auspices of Shelter Housing Support and Administration. Entirely different department here and an entirely different set of supports. We have a housing crisis at every point along the spectrum. People who are in shelters wouldn't be able to come up with most of these rooms, especially if we go to 6 dwelling rooms per home. In our neighborhood, they will likely go for $700 a month. So the people in the shelter system don't have $700 a month. They are not in a position to pay any rent at all. And there are very many more of them right now because our pandemic hit us at the same time our opioid crisis was hitting us, the North American opioid crisis. And so we started out with 7 or 8 hotels. We're now up there, 28 hotels in Toronto, helping us to spread out our shelter population for COVID safety and absorb some of the newly homeless people. But these are people that need a much higher degree of support than people who can afford to pay the rent in a licensed rooming house and can afford to live their independent lives. The solutions that we're looking at for people in our homeless residences really fit into that category that is going on in another controversial initiative. We're doing our best using speedy modular construction solutions that we call supportive housing. Those are we try and keep them small amounts. They have anywhere from 40 to 70 units in them. But the reason they're kept at that number of units is because what they have on their ground floor is wraparound supports, because those are people that are not ready to pay for shelter at all. And we need to get them to where they are, where they're able to re-enter society, they're able to deal with their health issues, and they're able to even to deal with social supports. These are people who can't even really manage their social supports enough to get an OW check in their hand. And so that's a separate initiative and a separate part of our housing crisis. And for those people, shelter housing support and admin is working round the clock. We know that as the pandemic ends, we've got to begin to move people back into shelters in the design we used to have, which means more people can be in the permanent shelters that we own. We can go back to having more people in them, hopefully not overcrowded, but some more people in them. And then start to wind down the hotels by supporting those people in them to get them all of the social supports in place, get them into opportunities like supportive opportunities, modular housing, health programs, those types of things. It's a different kettle of fish, but it's a very real and present issue, as you know, because in Don Valley North, you are playing host to one of those 28 hotels. Yeah.
Thank you, Shelley. And thank you, our panelists. So I'm going to pass it back to Shelley for the closing statement.
Oh, thank you, Maggie. I want to thank people for all of the communications that you've sent leading up to the town hall. I know a lot of people watched the community meeting, the planning and housing meeting, I should say, and have taken time. They responded to the e-blast on this issue when they got the town hall invite. Sent their thoughts in writing right away, and they really are going to inform my next steps. My next steps are, I know I'm going to be sitting down with the mayor and his staff. Everyone is going through their conversations. Although I teased one of his staff members today because in the suburbs, I'm one of the veterans. I've been dealing with this for a long time with Seneca campus. So some of the counselors over around Scarborough U of T are calling saying, I've had my conversation with John. Have you been yet? And we're starting to compare notes. So I sent a message to his staff saying, I better have that conversation sooner. It's not going to be fresh. But he's giving everyone one-on-one time because he's really grappling with this too. We know we're asking a lot, and so we know we've got to get it right or hold on. And so that's one of my next steps. And the other is to I'm going to be interacting a lot with my fellow counselors because if there are improvements to this, if there are motions contemplated that might give us comfort, I want to know about them ahead of time because I'd love to be able to share them with you. If they're all happening on the floor of council, I don't have time to ask you. So I'm going to be picking people's brains and trying to find out if I hear anything that's going to be moved that's going to give you comfort. You gave me homework tonight. I'll say that. You need to know a little more. I'm hearing people say, tell me more about this area where they're already legal. So I'm going to get the best and most up-to-date information where the 350 licensed rooming houses are, exactly what's going on. Are there illegal actions that we want to know about? Because people keep asking me that. And lastly, because this is one that concerns me greatly, and I heard it in questions tonight as well, is we need better definition about that condominium piece, the townhouse piece. Because as you know, the map that comes with the presentation shows some zones where the higher number of dwelling rooms will be contemplated. And yet for us, that's very much a neighborhood street. The units are fairly small and the map's doesn't have street names on it. So we have some mysteries that have to be solved and some language that has to explain what a condominium corporation's powers and abilities will be. And if the legal advice is that should be defined, that's another recommendation I would move to add to make sure that we have some clarity on that. So I've got some homework, and you should keep an eye on things because as we get close to council, if I need to reach out because I've heard things, I will. But I want to thank you all for once again. I know virtual is never ideal. We'd love to be in a gymnasium on something this crucial. So I want to thank you for once again staring into a screen while we deal with something virtually. Very soon we'll be able to do things in a gymnasium once again. Thank you very much, everybody. Please, I hope everyone will join me in a round of virtual applause for my guests, for Carola Perez-Book, for Emma Valley, I think is going to give this presentation one more time in council, and Jean-Paul Nadeau, our bylaw enforcement officer. Thank you guys very much for helping us out with this. Have a very good holiday tomorrow, everyone.
Thank you.